March 12, 1945, 4:30 in the morning. The Rhine Valley sleeps under a blanket of pre-dawn fog, thick enough to swallow sound, dense enough to hide armies. Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann holds a compass with trembling fingers, not from fear, but from the bone-deep cold that seeps through wool and leather and finds the spaces between ribs. His breath creates small clouds that dissipate into the larger gray that surrounds everything. The map crinkles as he unfolds it again. Third time in 10 minutes. The pencil marks seem to shift in the weak beam of his flashlight, coordinates dancing like they're mocking him. 247 degrees southeast. Or was it 257? The numbers blur together, handwriting smudged by yesterday's rain and today's condensation from his own breathing on the paper. Behind him, 8 men wait in silence. They trust him to guide them through this valley, to lead them to the rendezvous point where ammunition waits. Ammunition their unit desperately needs as the Reich crumbles around them like a house of cards in a windstorm. But Klaus stares at the map and feels something twist in his stomach, something that has nothing to do with hunger, though he hasn't eaten in 18 hours. The compass needle wavers, east by southeast. He's sure now, almost sure. The pencil mark points toward what should be friendly territory, what the briefing called a clear path through uncontested land. But as they crest a small hill and the fog begins to thin, Klaus sees something that makes his blood freeze in his veins. A flag. Clean, bright red with a white cross, hanging limp in the still air, but unmistakable even in the gray morning light. Swiss. They're looking at Switzerland. He's led his patrol across an international border, into neutral territory, into what could become an international incident, or worse, a massacre, if either side panics. The wrong coordinates, the misread map, the slight deviation that seemed so insignificant 20 minutes ago has just transformed 8 German soldiers into invaders of a country that has remained untouched by this war. Klaus raises his hand, and his men freeze behind him. In the distance, perhaps 50 meters away, a Swiss border guard emerges from a small wooden hut, rifle in hand, but not yet raised. Their eyes meet across the narrow valley. Both men understand instantly what has happened. Both know that the next 60 seconds will determine whether this mistake becomes a footnote or a tragedy. The Swiss guard's finger rests near his trigger guard. Standard protocol demands he fire a warning shot, alert his commanders. Treat this as what it technically is, an invasion. But something in the German's face, some mixture of confusion and dawning horror, gives him pause. Klaus slowly, deliberately, begins to raise his hands. And in that moment of hesitation, in that space between duty and humanity, 8 lives hang in the balance. Not just the lives of the German patrol, but the lives of the Swiss civilians sleeping in the village below, unaware that war has just knocked on their door, wearing the wrong uniform and carrying the wrong map. This is the story of the mistake that almost started a massacre, and the humanity that stopped it. This is the story of how being lost sometimes saves you from being found. In war, mistakes usually kill. Men die because of miscommunication, because of fog, because someone reads a number wrong or turns left instead of right. War is precision machinery, and when precision fails, blood flows. Every military manual ever written emphasizes the importance of accuracy in navigation, in communication, in timing. Because in war, there is no room for error. But sometimes, just sometimes, it's the error that saves lives. The morning of March 12th was supposed to be routine, As routine as anything could be in the final, desperate months of the Third Reich, when seasoned soldiers were dead or captured, and boys barely old enough to shave carried rifles through foreign forests. Klaus Zimmermann was 22, which made him a veteran by the standards of his rapidly diminishing unit. He'd been reading maps since he was 14, had guided hunting parties through the Black Forest, knew how to find north when the sun was hidden, and how to judge distance by the sound of moving water. But war has a way of making experts into amateurs, of turning the familiar into the alien. The map Klaus carried that morning had been copied by hand from another map, which had been traced from aerial reconnaissance photos taken 3 weeks earlier. 3 layers of translation between reality and paper, 3 opportunities for a line to shift, a number to change, a coordinate to become something else entirely. The original mission was simple in the way that desperate missions always are. German forces were retreating along multiple fronts, but they still held positions along the Rhine. Ammunition dumps had been established in supposedly secure locations, and small patrols like Klaus's were tasked with moving supplies from these caches to forward positions. Keep the machine running a little longer. Buy time for, well, no one really knew what they were buying time for anymore. But orders were orders, and soldiers followed orders, even when those orders felt like trying to bail water from a sinking ship with a teacup. Klaus's patrol consisted of 8 men, ranging in age from 18 to 34. There was Mueller, the mechanic from Dresden, who could fix anything mechanical but got lost in his own neighborhood. Werner, who'd been a school teacher before the war and still corrected grammar even when whispering in trenches. Young Hartmann, who'd lied about his age to enlist and was probably still lying about it now. 8 men who should have been farmers, teachers, mechanics, fathers. Instead, they were soldiers carrying outdated rifles through a valley that wasn't supposed to exist on their maps. The Swiss border guard watching them emerge from the fog was named Johann Fuchs, 28 years old, father of 2 daughters, who were probably still asleep in their beds 3 kilometers away in the village of Rheinwald. Johann had been on border duty for 18 months, ever since Switzerland had mobilized to defend its neutrality. 18 months of watching the war rage around his country's borders, 18 months of seeing refugees stumble across mountain passes, 18 months of maintaining the impossible balance between military readiness and humanitarian compassion. Johann knew the protocols. Foreign soldiers on Swiss soil were to be disarmed and interned. If they resisted, force was authorized. If they appeared to be conducting military operations, they were to be stopped by any means necessary. The survival of Swiss neutrality depended on these protocols being followed without exception. But protocols assume clarity, and there was nothing clear about 8 confused German soldiers standing in morning fog, their leader slowly raising his hands in what looked more like surrender than aggression. Have you ever made a mistake that saved someone's life without you knowing it? Have you ever taken a wrong turn that kept you from being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Most of us never know when our errors become someone else's salvation. But Klaus Zimmermann would know. He would spend the rest of his life knowing exactly what his misread map prevented. The mathematics of the mistake were simple. Klaus had read the bearing as 247 degrees instead of 257. 10 degrees. The difference between pointing toward a German-controlled valley and pointing toward Swiss territory. 10 degrees that represented perhaps 800 meters of lateral displacement over the distance they'd traveled. A margin of error that any instructor would have failed him for in training, but which now stood between his patrol and a firefight that no one wanted. Johann Fuchs lowered his rifle slowly, keeping it ready but not aggressive. He called out in German, his accent clearly Swiss, but his words unmistakably understanding. "You are in Switzerland. This is neutral territory. State your business." Klaus felt his throat close. The words he needed to say seemed impossible to form. How do you explain that you're lost? How do you admit that you've violated international law because you can't read a map properly? How do you ask for mercy from someone whose country you've just technically invaded? We are lost, Klaus managed finally. The words came out in a voice that sounded smaller than he intended. We were seeking supplies. We did not intend to cross the border. Johann studied the German soldiers. They looked tired, hungry, young. Their uniforms were patched and their equipment was clearly second-hand. These weren't elite troops conducting reconnaissance. These weren't advanced scouts for an invasion force. These were scared boys who'd taken a wrong turn in a war that was already lost. Behind Johann, another Swiss guard emerged from the hut. Then another. Standard procedure called for them to surround the Germans, disarm them, march them to an internment facility. But something in the morning air, something in the way the German patrol stood with their weapons lowered and their hands visible, suggested that this situation required something other than standard procedure. Klaus looked at his men. Werner was translating quietly for Hartmann, whose German was still rough around the edges. Miller was staring at the Swiss flag as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. They all understood that their lives were now in the hands of men they'd been taught to see as potential enemies. Men whose neutrality was supposed to be absolute, but whose humanity was about to be tested. The silence stretched between the two groups. 8 German soldiers, 3 Swiss guards, 50 meters of no man's land that wasn't supposed to exist. And somewhere in that silence, a decision was being made that would ripple through the lives of everyone present, though none of them could know it yet. Johann made the first move. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, not setting it down, not surrendering his authority, but making it clear that he didn't intend to use it immediately. The gesture was small, almost insignificant, but it changed everything. It transformed a potential firefight into a conversation. It turned invasion into mistake, and mistake into opportunity. "How lost are you?" Johann asked. It was such a simple question, but it contained multitudes. It acknowledged that being lost was different from being invasive. It suggested that solutions might exist beyond the stark alternatives of surrender or conflict. It opened a door that military protocol insisted should remain closed. Klaus pulled out his map, his hands still shaking slightly. "We were meant to be here," he said, pointing to a location clearly inside German territory. "But I think we're actually here." His finger moved to their current position, just inside the Swiss border. Johann stepped closer, close enough to see the map, close enough to smell the wet wool and unwashed exhaustion coming off the German soldiers. Close enough to see that Klaus's eyes were the same color as his own younger brother's. Close enough to realize that this mistake might be the first good thing to happen to anyone in this valley for months. The map told the story more clearly than words could. Klaus had indeed misread the coordinates, but he'd also been working with information that was 3 weeks old. The German positions marked on his map no longer existed. The ammunition dump he'd been seeking had been overrun by Allied forces 4 days earlier. If Klaus had read his coordinates correctly, if he'd led his patrol to the right location, they would have walked directly into a trap. They would have been captured or killed, and their deaths would have accomplished nothing except adding 8 more names to lists that were already too long. Johann realized this before Klaus did. The Swiss Guard had access to better intelligence, knew which German positions had fallen and which were still contested. He could see that Klaus's patrol wasn't lost. They were saved. The wrong turn that had brought them into Switzerland had kept them away from certain destruction. But how do you explain to someone that their mistake was actually a miracle? How do you tell a soldier that his failure as a navigator might have been his success as a human being? The conversation that followed lasted perhaps 20 minutes, but it would be remembered for decades. Johann explained, carefully and quietly, that the destination on Klaus's map was no longer in German hands. Klaus stared at the paper as if seeing it for the first time, understanding slowly that his navigational error had been their salvation. The Swiss guards faced their own dilemma. Military protocol demanded that they intern the German soldiers, but these men posed no threat to Swiss security. They were lost, demoralized, and clearly eager to avoid conflict. More importantly, sending them back across the border would likely mean sending them to their deaths or capture. Johann made a decision that wasn't his to make, but which felt like the only decision a human being could make. He told Klaus that he and his men could return to German territory if they wished, but that they should consider very carefully whether that was actually what they wanted to do. He suggested that there might be other options that didn't involve anyone dying for the sake of coordinates on a map. What happened next depends on whose account you read, whose memory you trust. Official Swiss records indicate that 8 German soldiers requested asylum and were processed according to international law. German records, where they exist at all, suggest that a patrol went missing in action near the Rhine. But the human truth is more complex than official records ever capture. Klaus and his men spent 3 hours in that valley, sitting on logs and stones, sharing Swiss chocolate and German cigarettes, talking in the careful way that soldiers talk when they're trying to decide whether they're prisoners or guests. The Swiss guards radioed their superiors and received instructions that were notably flexible. Process the situation according to the circumstances. Ensure no threats to Swiss security. Maintain neutrality while respecting humanitarian concerns. By 8 in the morning, as the fog lifted and revealed the full scope of the valley they'd stumbled into, Klaus Zimmermann had made perhaps the most important decision of his life. He folded his map carefully, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and told Johann Fuchs that he and his men would like to request asylum in Switzerland. They weren't defecting exactly. They weren't surrendering to enemy forces. They were accepting the consequences of a navigation error that had transformed into a navigation miracle. They were choosing life over duty, hope over hopelessness, humanity over ideology. Werner, the schoolteacher, would later say that it felt like waking up from a nightmare he hadn't realized he was having. Müller, the mechanic, described it as the first time in 2 years that he'd made a decision for himself rather than following orders. Young Hartmann, who might not have been old enough to be there anyway, simply said it felt like the first morning of his adult life. Johann Fuchs watched the German soldiers disappear into Swiss custody and felt something he hadn't experienced since the war began. A sense that he'd been part of something constructive rather than merely defensive. He'd followed protocol, but he'd also followed his conscience, and somehow the two had aligned in a way that saved lives instead of ending them. But the story doesn't end with asylum requests and humanitarian gestures. The story continues in the ripples that spread outward from that morning, in the lives that were preserved and the decisions that were enabled by a misread map. Klaus Zimmermann never fired another shot in the war. Neither did Werner, Müller, Hartmann, or any of the others. 8 soldiers removed from the machinery of violence. 8 fewer guns pointed at other soldiers who were also someone's sons and brothers and fathers. The mathematics of war reduction are always small-scale, always personal, always measured in individual lives rather than strategic victories. But sometimes individual lives add up to something larger. The Swiss internment camps were not pleasant places, but they were safe places. Klaus and his men spent the remaining weeks of the war cutting timber, building roads, learning to be civilians again under the supervision of guards who treated them as workers rather than enemies. They ate regularly, not well, but regularly. They slept in beds instead of trenches. They wrote letters to families who had assumed they were dead. Klaus wrote to his mother in Bavaria, telling her only that he was safe and would return when the war ended. He didn't mention Switzerland, didn't mention the map, didn't mention the morning when taking a wrong turn had saved his life. Some truths are too large for letters, too complex for explanations that might be read by censors or military authorities. But he kept the map. Throughout his internment, through his eventual return to Germany, through the long process of rebuilding a life in a country that had to learn how to exist without war, Klaus kept that hand-drawn, poorly copied, coordinate-confused piece of paper. He kept it as a reminder that being wrong can sometimes be more valuable than being right. The other members of his patrol scattered after the war. Werner returned to teaching, though he never again corrected students' grammar with quite the same authority. Müller opened a garage in Munich and became known for his ability to fix things that other mechanics declared impossible. Hartmann, whose real age remained a mystery, became a translator for the American occupation forces and eventually emigrated to Chicago, where he changed his name and became a thoroughly American grandfather who told his grandchildren stories about the importance of reading maps carefully. But Johann Fuchs might have carried the heaviest burden of all. He knew something that Klaus would never know. He knew what had happened to the other German patrols that morning, the ones who had read their maps correctly and arrived at their intended destinations. Swiss intelligence networks were more extensive than most people realized. Neutrality required information, and information meant knowing what was happening on all sides of the borders you were protecting. Johann knew that 3 other German patrols had been operating in the region that morning. 2 had been captured by Allied forces. 1 had been killed in a firefight that lasted less than 10 minutes. 24 German soldiers had set out that morning, seeking ammunition to extend a war that was already lost. Only 8 had survived, and they had survived because they had failed to reach their destination. They had lived because Klaus Zimmermann couldn't read coordinates properly in the fog. Do you think Johann should have told Klaus this? Do you think knowing the full scope of what his mistake had prevented would have been a gift or a burden? These are the questions that keep people awake at night, decades after war's end. The moral mathematics that never quite balance no matter how often you recalculate them. Johann never told Klaus, but he told his daughters. When they were old enough to understand complexity, old enough to grapple with the idea that right and wrong aren't always clearly marked on maps, he told them about the morning when 8 lost soldiers taught him that mercy could be more powerful than military precision. His daughters grew up to be teachers themselves. One taught history, the other taught geography. Both spent their careers helping students understand that navigation isn't just about getting from one place to another. It's about understanding where you are and why that matters. They taught their students that maps are human documents, created by people, interpreted by people, and subject to all the errors and insights that human beings bring to every endeavor. The history teacher would begin each school year by showing her students Klaus's map. Johann had kept it. Klaus had given it to him as they parted, saying he'd seen enough of where it led and preferred to trust others to show him the way forward. She would point out the smudged coordinates, the hand-copied route markings, the pencil erasures where Klaus had second-guessed himself. This map, she would tell her students, contains one of the most important mistakes in history. Not because it changed the outcome of the war, but because it changed the outcome for 8 families who got to welcome their sons home instead of mourning them. The geography teacher used the same map differently. She would have her students practice reading coordinates, plotting routes, calculating bearings, but she would always end the lesson by reminding them that maps are tools, not masters. That the most important navigation happens in the space between what you think you know and what you're willing to learn. Both sisters understood something that their father had taught them without ever saying it directly, that the most profound moments in human history often happen in the gaps between intention and outcome, in the spaces where individual choices intersect with larger forces, in the moments when being human matters more than being right. Klaus Zimmermann returned to Bavaria in late 1946, carrying citizenship papers that identified him as a former internee rather than a former soldier. He found work as a surveyor, spending his days creating the kinds of maps that he'd once misread so catastrophically. He was good at his job, careful, precise, obsessively accurate. He checked his calculations multiple times, verified his measurements, created documents that other people could trust absolutely. But he never forgot that precision and truth aren't always the same thing. His maps were accurate, but the map that had saved his life had been wrong in every technical sense, while being absolutely right in every human sense. He married Anna, a widow whose first husband had died in Stalingrad. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and Klaus taught them to read maps the way his father had taught him, carefully, with respect for the power that navigation holds over human lives. But he also taught them that maps are tools for finding your way, not rules for where you're allowed to go. The boy became an engineer, designing roads that connected towns and cities across the rebuilding landscape of post-war Germany. The girl became a nurse, working with refugees and displaced persons, people who'd lost their maps entirely and needed to find new ways of navigating the world. Both children grew up hearing the story of the morning their father got lost and found his life. Not the full story. Klaus never told them about Johann Fuchs, never mentioned Switzerland, never revealed the specific details that might have implications for other people's privacy or security. But he told them enough for them to understand that being lost sometimes means being exactly where you need to be. Years passed. The Cold War replaced the hot one, dividing Europe with new borders that made Klaus's accidental crossing seem quaint by comparison. Klaus's children had children of their own. Anna died in 1978, peaceful in her sleep, dreaming perhaps of the husband who'd come home from a war that had taken so many others. Klaus lived until 1991, long enough to see the Berlin Wall fall, long enough to watch Germany reunify, long enough to witness the transformation of enemies into allies and borders into passages rather than barriers. He died with the misread map in his bedside table, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture and time. His son found the map while sorting through Klaus's belongings. The coordinates meant nothing to him. He was an engineer, not a soldier, and the landmarks referenced in the hand-drawn document no longer existed. But he recognized the careful way his father had preserved it, understood that this piece of paper had significance beyond its apparent function. He took the map to a military historian at the University of Munich, hoping to learn something about his father's war service that Klaus had never shared. The historian studied the document for several days, cross-referencing coordinates with known German positions, comparing routes with Allied intelligence reports, mapping the movement of forces during those final chaotic weeks of the war. When the historian called Klaus's son back to his office, his voice was quiet, with the kind of awe that academics rarely express. "Your father," he said, "was supposed to die on March 12, 1945. These coordinates would have led him directly into an Allied ambush. Every other German patrol in this sector was killed or captured that morning. Your father lived because he couldn't read a map correctly in the fog." Klaus's son stared at the paper that had preserved his father's life, and, by extension, his own existence. Everything he'd accomplished, every road he'd built, every bridge he'd designed, every moment of joy and purpose and meaning in his life. All of it had been made possible by his father's inability to distinguish between 247 and 257 degrees in poor light. He donated the map to a museum, but not before making a careful copy. The copy he framed and hung in his office, where it served as a daily reminder that the most important engineering principle isn't precision, it's resilience. The ability to adapt when your calculations prove wrong, to find new routes when the intended path leads to destruction, to build bridges across gaps that weren't supposed to exist. The museum curator who received Klaus's map was a woman named Sarah Mueller. No relation to the mechanic from Klaus's patrol, but connected by the strange coincidences that seem to cluster around stories like this. Sarah had been researching Swiss neutrality during World War II, trying to understand how a small country had managed to maintain its independence while surrounded by conflict. Klaus's map became a centerpiece of her research, not because it revealed military secrets or strategic insights, but because it illustrated something more important: the human dimension of neutrality, the individual choices that made abstract political concepts into lived realities. Sarah's research led her to Swiss archives, where she found records of the 8 German soldiers who had requested asylum in March of 1945. The files were routine, bureaucratic, focused on processing procedures and administrative details. But one file contained a note written by Johann Fuchs, the border guard who had first encountered Klaus's patrol. The note was brief, handwritten, filed with the kind of careful precision that Swiss record-keeping demanded. But between the lines of official language, Sarah could read a story of moral complexity, of a man who had chosen humanity over protocol and lived with the consequences of that choice for the rest of his life. Johann had written, "These soldiers posed no threat to Swiss security. They were lost, confused, and grateful for assistance. Their navigation error may have saved their lives, as their intended destination was no longer under friendly control. I recommended processing them for asylum rather than immediate repatriation, believing this decision served both humanitarian concerns and the long-term interests of Swiss neutrality." Sarah understood that she was reading about a moment when abstract principles had become personal choices, when the machinery of war had been interrupted by individual human beings who chose to see each other as human beings rather than as problems to be solved or threats to be eliminated. She spent 3 years researching the story, tracking down records, interviewing survivors, piecing together the full scope of what had happened in that valley on March 12, 1945. Her book, published in 1998, was titled The Map That Led Home, and it told the story of Klaus's navigation error and its consequences through the lens of what she called accidental diplomacy, the way individual mistakes can create opportunities for unexpected understanding. The book found readers far beyond academic circles. It was translated into 12 languages, adapted for radio broadcasts, cited in discussions about refugee policy and humanitarian intervention. But perhaps more importantly, it found its way to Rheinwald, the Swiss village where Johann Fuchs had lived and worked and raised his daughters. Johann had died in 1987, 4 years before Klaus, peaceful in his garden, tending tomatoes that would ripen without him. But his daughters were still alive, still teaching, still carrying forward the lessons of that morning when their father had chosen mercy over military precision. They read Sarah's book with tears in their eyes, recognizing their father's voice in the archived documents, seeing their own childhood memories reflected in the careful research of a historian who understood that some stories are too important to remain buried in files and forgotten in archives. The younger daughter, Maria, wrote to Sarah, thanking her for preserving a story that had shaped her family's understanding of what it meant to be human in inhuman times. But Maria also shared something that Sarah hadn't found in any archive: the rest of the story, the part that Johann had told his daughters but had never written in any official report. After Klaus and his patrol had been processed and transferred to internment facilities, Johann had continued to monitor German military communications in his sector. He'd listened to radio chatter about missing patrols, heard commanders trying to account for soldiers who'd simply vanished into the fog. He'd tracked the movements of Allied forces and understood exactly what had happened to the German units that had reached their intended destinations. Johann had known, from the afternoon of March 12th forward, that Klaus Zimmermann's navigation error had been the difference between life and death for 8 men. He'd carried that knowledge for 42 years, never sharing it with anyone except his daughters, never turning it into a story that might diminish the dignity of the soldiers who died or the sacrifice of their families. But he'd also carried the weight of understanding that neutrality wasn't passive, that maintaining peace required active choices, that sometimes the most important military action was deciding not to act militarily at all. Maria's letter to Sarah included a photograph, Johann in uniform, standing beside the border hut where he'd encountered Klaus's patrol. Behind him, barely visible in the background, was the flagpole with its Swiss flag, the red cross on white background that had signaled to Klaus that his navigation had gone wrong and his life had been saved. Sarah added Maria's letter to her research files, understanding that some stories continue long after historians think they've reached the end. Klaus's misread map had created ripples that continued to spread decades later, touching the lives of people who'd never heard of him, but who lived in a world that was fractionally more hopeful because 8 soldiers had chosen asylum over destruction. The photograph of Johann Fuchs found its way into a second edition of Sarah's book, and from there into museum displays, educational materials, and online archives. Students around the world began encountering the image of a Swiss border guard who'd faced an impossible choice and found a third option that no military manual had prepared him for. In 2015, 70 years after Klaus Zimmermann misread his coordinates in the fog, a group of Swiss and German historians organized a commemoration at the site where the encounter had taken place. The border hut was gone, replaced by modern facilities and electronic monitoring systems. The valley looked different, reforested, developed, divided by highways that connected rather than separated the communities on either side of the border. But the flag was still there, and the mountains still created fog on March mornings, and the coordinates that Klaus had misread were still marked on modern maps as the point where a small mistake had prevented a larger tragedy. Klaus's grandson attended the commemoration, carrying the copy of the map that his father had preserved. Johann's granddaughter was there too, representing a family that had spent 3 generations teaching others about the morning when navigation error became humanitarian triumph. They met for the first time at the ceremony. 2 families connected by a mistake that had become a mercy, by coordinates that had led to confusion and then to understanding. They stood together as speakers talked about neutrality and diplomacy, about the importance of international law and humanitarian principles. But afterward, when the official presentations were finished and the dignitaries had departed, they sat on a log near where Johann's border hut had once stood, and Klaus's grandson asked the question that had been troubling him since he'd first learned about his grandfather's war experience. "Do you think," he asked, "that my grandfather would have made the same choice if he'd known his mistake would save his life? If he'd known that reading the map correctly would have led to his death?" Johann's granddaughter considered the question carefully. She'd grown up with her grandfather's story, understood the moral complexity that had shaped her family's understanding of choice and consequence. But she'd also grown up in a world where such questions could be discussed openly, where the mistakes and mercies of the past could be examined without fear of judgment or reprisal. "I think," she said finally, "that your grandfather would have read the map the best way he knew how, whatever the consequences. The mistake wasn't a choice, it was just human. But what happened after the mistake? The way both our grandfathers chose to handle an impossible situation, that was a choice. And I think they'd make the same choice again. They sat in silence for a while, two strangers connected by history, looking out over a valley where fog still gathered on March mornings and where borders still existed but no longer felt like barriers. The map that had brought them together was folded in Klaus's grandson's pocket. Its coordinates still wrong, its directions still confused, its value still immeasurable. As the sun set behind the mountains that had witnessed so much history, both families and all wars, they understood something that no map could show them, that the most important navigation happens not between places, but between people, not through geographical coordinates, but through moral choices that define who we are and who we choose to become. The mistake that had saved Klaus Zimmermann's life had become something larger than personal salvation. It had become a reminder that being human means being imperfect, and that sometimes our imperfections create opportunities for grace that our competencies could never provide. In war, precision usually kills, and confusion usually causes death. But on March 12, 1945, in a valley between Germany and Switzerland, confusion created space for mercy, and mercy created space for hope, and hope created space for 8 soldiers to choose life over duty, and for 2 border guards to choose humanity over protocol. The map was wrong, but the men were right. The coordinates were confused, but the conscience was clear. The navigation failed, but the human spirit found its way home. And in the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson any map can teach. That being lost sometimes means being exactly where you need to be, and that the wrong turn can be the right choice, and that the mistake that saves you is never really a mistake at all. If stories like this make you think about the humanity behind the chaos, about the individual choices that shape historical moments, about the maps we all carry and the coordinates we all sometimes misread, then perhaps you understand why some mistakes are worth preserving, why some errors are worth remembering, and why the most important navigation happens in the space between what we intend and what we become.